Okay, so you want to own the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building on Earth, over 800 meters of glass and steel piercing the Dubai skyline, a structure so tall that people on the observation deck can watch the sun set twice in the same evening because the horizon curves away beneath them. Your name attached to the single most photographed building on the planet, a structure that appears in the opening shot of half the movies and television shows ever set in the Middle East. That's the picture in your head. Look at any list of the world's most valuable real estate, and this building sits near the top, a physical monument to wealth and ambition that tourists travel across the planet specifically to see in person. You think, owning something like this must be one of the great trophy investments of modern real estate, a building so iconic that money almost becomes secondary to the prestige of simply having your name on the deed. Here's the problem. You are looking at the one part of this building that was specifically engineered to be photographed, while the actual financial reality of owning and operating the tallest structure on Earth involves a set of economics so strange and so specific to extreme height that almost nothing about how a normal skyscraper makes money applies here in the way you'd expect. The truth is that a super tall tower like this is not really a single real estate asset in the way people imagine it. It is a vertical city with its own internal logistics problems, its own extreme engineering costs that scale in ways regular buildings simply never encounter, and a business model built as much around global branding and national prestige as around rentable square footage. And once you understand that, everything about why buildings this tall almost never make sense as a pure financial investment, and why they get built anyway, starts to make sense. Let's start with what it costs just to get a building like this out of the ground. There isn't really a comparable category for a super tall tower, the industry term for anything over 300 meters. The Burj Khalifa itself costs somewhere in the range of $1.5 billion to construct, a genuinely enormous number. But what makes that number interesting isn't the total. It's how non-linearly it scales compared to a normal building. A 50-story office tower and a 100-story office tower don't cost twice as much per floor just because one is twice as tall. Past a certain height, every additional floor becomes disproportionately more expensive because the entire building has to solve engineering problems that simply don't exist at lower heights at all. Wind load is the first of these, and it's a genuinely brutal problem at extreme height. A building this tall doesn't just sit still, it sways, measurably, constantly, in response to wind pressure that increases significantly the higher you go, because wind speeds at height are dramatically stronger and more turbulent than at street level, sometimes multiples stronger than what's measured at ground level on the exact same day. Engineers have to design the entire structural system, the concrete core, the steel reinforcement, the building's actual shape, specifically to manage this sway within a range that's imperceptible or at least tolerable to occupants. Because a building that visibly swayed several feet in a strong wind would be structurally sound but psychologically uninhabitable for anyone working or living near the top of it. The Burj Khalifa's distinctive tapering, spiraling shape isn't primarily an aesthetic choice. It's an engineering solution, specifically designed to disrupt wind vortices that would otherwise build up destructive resonant force against a simpler, uniform tower shape. A lesson learned in part from studying how earlier generations of very tall buildings behaved under similar wind conditions. Designing and testing this kind of aerodynamic performance requires wind tunnel modeling, computational fluid dynamics simulation, and iterative structural redesign that a normal building project never has to budget for at all. Then there's the concrete itself, and this is a genuinely counterintuitive engineering problem, one that construction teams working at more conventional heights simply never have to grapple with in any serious way. Pumping concrete to extreme heights is enormously difficult because concrete has to remain in a workable liquid state long enough to be pumped hundreds of meters upward through a pipe before it sets, and the pressure required to push liquid concrete that high, combined with the heat of the surrounding climate accelerating the setting process, creates a genuinely difficult logistical and chemical engineering challenge. The Burj Khalifa required a specially formulated concrete mix, and pumping records were set during its construction specifically because engineers had to solve a problem that essentially didn't have an established playbook at the time, developing techniques that the industry has since had to refine further for every subsequent super tall project. Now the foundation, because a building this heavy and this tall needs to transfer an enormous structural load into the ground without settling unevenly over time, which would be catastrophic for a structure of this height even at a scale of just a few centimeters of differential settlement. A tolerance so tight it would be considered almost irrelevant on a much shorter building. The foundation for a super tall tower like this involves hundreds of massive concrete piles driven deep into the ground, engineered specifically for the soil conditions of that exact site. because unlike almost every other cost category in this project, you cannot simply apply a generic foundation design and scale it up. The foundation has to be custom engineered for the specific geology beneath that exact patch of earth, adding significant cost and design time before a single visible floor gets built above ground. So add up the wind engineering, the specialized concrete logistics, the custom foundation work, and the enormous quantity of high-grade structural steel and glass required for the exterior curtain wall, and you start to understand why a super tall tower can cost multiples of what an equivalent amount of square footage would cost in a conventional 50 or 60-story building, before you've even gotten to the part of the building people actually occupy. Now let's talk about elevators, because this is where super tall towers reveal a genuinely strange economic problem that most people never think about. The deeper you dig into it, the more it explains about why buildings this tall are so financially unusual. In a normal building, elevators are a straightforward cost. You install enough of them to move people efficiently, and they take up a reasonable percentage of each floor's total square footage. In a super tall tower, elevators become a genuinely dominant design constraint. A single elevator shaft simply cannot efficiently run the entire height of an 800-meter building. The wait times and travel times would be commercially unworkable for anyone actually trying to use the building day to day. The Burj Khalifa solves this with a system of sky lobbies, essentially transfer stations partway up the building where occupants switch from one elevator bank to another, similar in concept to how a subway system requires a transfer between different lines to reach a distant destination. The elevators themselves had to be engineered specifically to handle the extreme travel distances involved, moving at speeds considerably faster than a conventional building's elevator system, while still managing acceleration and deceleration forces gently enough that passengers don't experience noticeable discomfort during a single continuous vertical trip covering hundreds of meters. This solves the mechanical problem, but it comes at an enormous cost in usable floor space. Every elevator shaft, every sky lobby, every mechanical floor dedicated purely to elevator equipment and building systems is square footage that generates zero rental income. And in a super tall tower, that non-rentable percentage of total floor space can run dramatically higher than in a conventional building, sometimes consuming 25 to 40% of total constructed area once you account for elevator shafts, mechanical floors, structural cores, and refuge floors required by fire safety codes at extreme height. This is the part that genuinely surprises people modeling super tall towers financially for the first time. You're paying the enormous, non-linearly scaling construction cost for the entire height of the building, but a meaningful percentage of that expensive vertical square footage never generates a single dollar of rent, because it's structurally and mechanically required just to make the building function at all. The taller the building goes, the worse this ratio tends to get, because the mechanical and structural requirements scale up faster than the usable floor space does. Now, let's talk about how a building like this actually generates revenue, because the Burj Khalifa specifically is a genuinely unusual mixed-use asset, not a single-purpose office tower or residential building. The lower and middle sections contain luxury residential units and a hotel. The upper floors contain the observation deck, one of the most visited paid attractions in the world, and a small amount of office and retail space is woven throughout. Each of these revenue streams operates on a completely different financial logic. Residential units, once sold, generate a single upfront capital return to whoever developed and sold them, plus ongoing service charges from the building's homeowners association covering maintenance. But they don't generate recurring rental income to the building's original owner unless those units were specifically retained as rentals rather than sold outright. The hotel portion operates on standard hospitality economics, room rates, occupancy percentage, and food and beverage revenue, but calibrated to an extreme luxury positioning that comes with correspondingly extreme operating costs, staffing ratios, and service standards. The observation deck is genuinely the most interesting revenue engine in the entire building because it's essentially running a completely different business model layered inside a skyscraper. A ticketed tourist attraction with strong, predictable, high-margin economics that have almost nothing to do with real estate at all. Millions of visitors purchase tickets annually to ride the elevator up and look out over the city, and unlike office or residential space, the marginal cost of one additional visitor riding the express elevator to the observation floor is remarkably small compared to the ticket price charged, meaning this specific slice of the building can carry genuinely excellent profit margins even while the office and residential portions of the same structure struggle to justify their construction costs through rental income alone. Here's the maintenance reality that catches people off guard, because operating costs for a building this tall scale in the same non-linear way construction costs do, a pattern that repeats itself across almost every single system in the building once you look closely enough. Window cleaning alone requires specialized equipment, robotic and human-operated cleaning systems engineered specifically to operate safely at extreme height in wind conditions that would make conventional window washing equipment completely impractical. And a building with this much exterior glass surface area requires a continuous, essentially never-ending cleaning cycle, because by the time you finish cleaning the entire exterior, it's already time to start again from the beginning. Elevator maintenance is similarly extreme. The mechanical systems required to move people efficiently across this kind of vertical distance require more frequent, more specialized servicing than a conventional building's elevator bank, and any elevator downtime in a super tall tower creates a genuinely serious operational problem because there's no reasonable walking alternative for someone stuck on the 80th floor the way there might be in a 10-story building. Climate control presents its own extreme height problem entirely, one that engineers designing a conventional office building rarely need to think about at all beyond a single uniform system. The temperature and wind conditions at the top of an 800-meter building can differ dramatically from conditions at street level, sometimes by a genuinely significant margin, which means the building's climate control systems have to manage a much wider range of environmental conditions across different height zones than a conventional building's uniform system would ever need to handle. And the sheer volume of air that needs to be moved and conditioned across a structure of this height requires industrial-scale mechanical systems that consume enormous amounts of energy continuously, a recurring operating cost that scales with the building's height in a way that dramatically outpaces how that cost scales for a normal-sized structure. Now, the branding and prestige economics, because this is genuinely where a super tall tower's financial logic diverges most sharply from a conventional real estate investment, and it's worth understanding honestly rather than dismissing it as simply irrational spending. A structure like this functions, for the city and the developer both, as an extraordinarily effective piece of global marketing, one that generates a level of international media coverage, tourism, and brand association that would cost an almost incalculable amount to purchase through conventional advertising if you tried to buy that same level of global name recognition through any other channel, since no advertising budget of any realistic size could reliably manufacture the kind of organic, repeated global media presence a genuinely record-breaking structure generates simply by existing. Dubai specifically used this building as a centerpiece of a broader strategy to establish itself as a global business, tourism, and luxury destination, and by that measure, the building has been extraordinarily successful, driving tourism revenue, luxury real estate demand throughout the surrounding district, and international brand recognition for the city as a whole that extends dramatically beyond whatever direct rental income the tower itself generates. This is genuinely difficult to model using conventional real estate return metrics, because a meaningful part of the actual return on this kind of project shows up as economic activity spread across an entire city and an entire tourism industry, rather than as a clean, isolated cash flow statement for the single building itself. Now, who actually owns a structure like this? Because the ownership arrangement itself is unusual compared to a conventional single-owner office tower. The Burj Khalifa is owned and was developed by a major state-linked real estate developer, and this matters enormously to the underlying economics, because a purely private, profit-maximizing investor evaluating this project on conventional real estate metrics alone would almost certainly never have greenlit construction at this scale and at this cost. A state-linked or state-adjacent developer can justify an investment horizon and a return calculation that includes national branding value, tourism sector growth, and adjacent land appreciation across an entire district as legitimate components of the return, in a way a purely private fund answerable only to financial investors typically cannot. This is a genuinely important structural point, because it explains why super tall towers of this kind tend to get built specifically in cities and countries pursuing an aggressive global branding strategy, rather than being built organically by private developers chasing pure rental yield in isolation. There's a psychological pricing dynamic worth understanding in the residential portion of a building like this, because it doesn't follow conventional real estate pricing logic based purely on square footage and amenities. Units positioned at extreme height, particularly those near the very top of the building, command a dramatic premium over otherwise comparable units lower down, a premium that has essentially nothing to do with construction cost, since building materials and finishes don't meaningfully change floor to floor, and everything to do with status signaling and the specific view corridor available at that exact elevation. This creates an unusual pricing curve where the very highest floors, the ones that were also the most expensive and most technically difficult floors to construct given the non-linear cost scaling discussed earlier, also command the highest per square foot resale price, meaning the developer's most expensive to build floors happen to align with the buyer segment most willing to pay a significant premium, a fortunate alignment that doesn't hold nearly as cleanly in a conventional mid-rise building where the cost to build any given floor is essentially identical regardless of its position in the structure. Security and access control represent another cost category that scales in a genuinely unusual way for a building serving this many different functions simultaneously under one roof. A structure combining a luxury hotel, private residences, office space, and one of the most visited tourist attractions on Earth needs to manage entirely separate, carefully controlled circulation patterns for each of these groups. Tourists queuing for the observation deck cannot be allowed to wander freely into residential floors. Hotel guests need a different level of access than office tenants, and residents expect a level of privacy and security screening that a typical mixed-use building serving a single, more homogeneous tenant population simply doesn't need to engineer for. This requires a genuinely sophisticated security and access control infrastructure, separate elevator banks and entry sequences for each user group, extensive credential systems, and a security staffing level that scales with the sheer diversity of people moving through the building on any given day, a cost that a conventional single-use office tower or residential building never has to budget for at anywhere near the same complexity. Let's talk about what can go wrong with a project like this, because super tall towers carry a specific kind of financial risk that conventional buildings simply don't. Construction timelines for super tall towers routinely extend well beyond initial projections. Because engineering problems at this scale frequently can't be fully solved on paper in advance, they get discovered and worked through during construction itself. And every month of delay on a project this large and this capital-intensive represents a genuinely enormous carrying cost in financing charges alone, money borrowed to fund construction that sits accruing interest while the building isn't yet generating any revenue at all. Several ambitious super-tall projects around the world have been announced with enormous fanfare and never completed, or completed years, and, in some cases, more than a decade behind their original schedule, as engineering challenges, financing difficulties, and shifting economic conditions during the extended construction period compounded against each other. A super tall tower represents an extraordinarily concentrated, illiquid, single-asset bet, and unlike a diversified real estate portfolio spread across dozens of conventional buildings, if the specific market for ultra-luxury residences or premium office space in that specific city softens during the years it takes to build and lease up a project this size, there's no diversification to absorb that risk. The entire enormous capital investment is riding on the success of one single structure in one single location. There's a real case study worth walking through here, because it shows exactly how this risk plays out when the surrounding market conditions don't cooperate. Several other ambitious super-tall projects announced around the same era as the Burj Khalifa, in various cities pursuing similar global branding strategies, were significantly scaled back, indefinitely delayed, or in some cases abandoned entirely after a global financial crisis hit while these projects were still under construction, leaving partially built structures and stalled financing arrangements that took years to fully resolve. Dubai's own broader real estate market experienced a severe downturn during roughly this same period, with property values across the city falling sharply, which meant the Burj Khalifa itself was completed and opened into a local market considerably weaker than the one that existed when the project was originally conceived and financed. The building's own opening, while a genuine global media spectacle, occurred against this considerably more difficult economic backdrop, and residential and commercial leasing in the surrounding district took meaningfully longer to reach the pace originally projected. A reminder that even a project engineered specifically to generate global attention and brand value is not insulated from the ordinary cyclical risks of the real estate market it happens to be built inside of. So how does a project like this actually make financial sense in plain mechanical terms? Once you accept that pure rental income from a conventional cap rate analysis likely doesn't fully justify the construction cost on its own. The answer generally involves layering together several different value streams that individually might not clear the bar, but collectively can. Residential unit sales generating substantial upfront capital recovery, hotel and observation deck revenue providing an ongoing high-margin operating income stream, adjacent land value appreciation across the surrounding district that the same developer often owns and can monetize separately, and the broader tourism and brand value captured at a city or national level, rather than purely at the building level. If the observation deck alone generates tens of millions of dollars annually in high-margin ticket revenue, and residential sales recover a substantial share of construction cost up front, the remaining office and hotel components don't need to carry the entire financial burden of justifying an outsized, non-linear construction cost on rental yield alone. Here's the volatility that comes alongside this math. tourism revenue for the observation deck is meaningfully exposed to broader economic conditions, regional political stability, and global travel patterns, all factors well outside the building's own control and a significant disruption to international tourism, the kind that happened globally in 2020, can eliminate a meaningful share of the building's highest margin revenue stream almost overnight, while the fixed maintenance and operating costs of a structure this complex and this tall continue accruing regardless of visitor volume that specific year. Let's put together the two versions of a single year for a building like this, because that's where the real financial picture becomes clear. In a strong year, tourism is robust. The observation deck runs near capacity with premium-priced fast-track tickets adding meaningful incremental revenue. The hotel maintains high occupancy at premium luxury rates, and the surrounding district's real estate values continue appreciating, benefiting the developer's broader land holdings even beyond the tower itself. Under those conditions, the combined revenue streams can genuinely justify the extraordinary construction cost over a long enough time horizon, and the building functions as a successful, if unconventional, piece of the broader development. In a weak year, tourism softens due to global economic conditions or regional instability. The observation deck's high-margin ticket revenue drops meaningfully. Luxury hotel demand softens as premium travelers pull back discretionary spending first, and the enormous fixed maintenance costs, window cleaning, elevator servicing, climate control across an 800-meter structure continue regardless, compressing the building's overall financial performance significantly even while the structure itself remains, from the street, exactly as visually spectacular as it was during the strong year. The difference between those two outcomes can run into tens of millions of dollars in a single year for a structure this complex, and almost none of it shows up as one dramatic headline event. It's a slightly softer tourism season here, a slightly lower luxury occupancy rate there, a maintenance contract renewed at a higher rate because specialized supertall height servicing has genuinely limited competitive providers, compounding quietly against a construction cost base that was already extraordinary to begin with. The elevators still run on schedule. The windows still gleam from the street below, cleaned on a cycle that never actually stops. The line for the observation deck still stretches around the base of the building most mornings, regardless of which version of the year is actually unfolding on the balance sheet upstairs. From street level, looking straight up at a structure that disappears into the clouds on a humid day, the good year and the difficult year are genuinely indistinguishable, because the difference was never something visible from the ground at all. And unlike almost any other building discussed in this genre, this asset was never purely evaluated as a standalone financial investment in the first place. It was built as a statement, and the honest answer to whether it makes sense financially depends entirely on whether you're measuring the return of the tower alone, or the return of an entire city's reputation, tourism economy, and global brand recognition that this one building was specifically designed to anchor. So if you ever find yourself dreaming about owning the tallest building in the world, remember the one thing that actually determines whether a project like this makes sense. It was never really about the rent you can collect floor by floor. It's about whether the story the building tells to the entire world is worth more than the balance sheet of the